America built more than 45,000 plantations on bodies it refused to name. The labor extracted, the suffering never written down, whippings recorded as discipline, deaths recorded as loss of property, children sold like inventory. When the system collapsed, it walked away. No reckoning, just ruins and records that go silent. What stayed behind are ghosts, haunting plantation grounds from Louisiana to South Carolina, returning to the same rooms, the same fields, decade after decade. The dead did not go quietly. On James Island, South Carolina, visitors still hear her, a woman's voice, clear, deliberate, singing Gullah Creole spirituals from an empty cabin. She sang while she worked the rows, not hymns, coded maps, escape routes hidden in the melody, until the morning they sold her daughter. She watched from the field as the child was taken. She stopped singing. 3 weeks later, she was dead. Staff say the singing continues. When they enter the cabin, it stops. Outside Savannah, a 4-year-old pointed to the lawn and began naming the children in the ground, one by one. Her parents had no knowledge of the land's history, but beneath the grass sat a plantation cistern where 11 children, dead from a cholera epidemic, had been placed temporarily while the ground dried. Nobody ever came back for them. Every name the girl spoke matched the plantation's 1832 death ledger exactly. Near an old post in Louisiana, visitors report their backs pulling tight without warning, breathing shallows. The body reacts to a threat the mind can't name. Then the sound of a heavy brass bell rings out across empty fields, followed by the frantic, unseen footsteps of dozens running. The overseer's bell was thrown into a river in 1863. It rings anyway. These are not stories. They are records that refuse to stay silent. America built its plantations on bodies it refused to name. These cursed houses are still standing. They never left. Mloud Plantation on James Island, South Carolina, was established in 1851 by William Mloud. At its peak, Mloud Plantation enslaved 74 people who worked the surrounding cotton fields from dawn until the overseer's bell rang at sunset. The estate sat on land that had been cleared and worked by enslaved people for decades before the Mloud family formalized their ownership. The coastal soil was fertile, the climate punishing, and the labor required to make cotton profitable was extracted through violence, fatigue, and the constant threat of sale. Among those forced to work the fields at Mloud Plantation was a woman the property's oral history remembers only as Praise Annie. Annie sang while she worked. Spirituals, work songs, hymns, loud enough that other workers could hear her across the rows. Her voice carried over the cotton and through the heat, a presence that the other workers came to rely on. They knew where she was in the field by the sound of her singing. They timed their movements to her rhythm. But the songs were not only for comfort. Gullah is not a dialect of English. It is a distinct Creole language that emerged from enslaved West Africans and English colonists in the 18th century, and it preserved the specific tonal frequencies of West African languages, Fula, Mende, Yoruba, Twi. These tonal frequencies were designed to carry across open spaces and be heard by those who needed to hear them, while remaining intelligible to anyone not trained in the language. The songs Annie sang were not just melodies, they were sonic fingerprints, coded messages woven into hymns that sounded like worship to anyone listening from the big house. Row the Boat Ashore was not a hymn. Row the boat referred to the coastal waterways used for escape. Ashore meant the next safe point on the journey north. Wade in the water warned of patrols ahead. Follow the drinking gourd pointed to the North Star. Annie was singing maps. She was singing survival into the air, where anyone could hear it and only those who needed to understand would know what it meant. In 1862, William Mloud needed cash. The Civil War had disrupted markets, cotton prices were unstable, credit was tight. He made the decision that plantation owners across the South made during the war. He sold people. Annie's 7-year-old daughter, whose name does not survive in any record, was among those sold. The Mloud Plantation birth ledger from 1855 records the child's birth. The entry lists no name, only female child, mother, Annie, value, none. The words are clinical. They're not cruel in any expressive way. They're the cruelty of a system so complete that it does not need to raise its voice to break a family. The child had no name in the ledger because she had no legal identity. She was an asset, not a person. Her value was listed as none because infants could not yet work and were therefore a financial liability until they grew old enough to generate profit. Family separation was not a side effect of slavery. It was a deliberate financial strategy. By 1860, approximately 1 in 5 enslaved marriages in the Upper South were broken by sale. Children under 10 were the most frequently sold demographic because they could not yet work full days. During economic downturns, they were the first to be liquidated. Annie was given no warning, no time to prepare her daughter, no chance to say goodbye in any meaningful way. She was working in the field when the transaction occurred. She watched from the rows as the child was taken to a wagon and driven towards Charleston's slave market. Annie stopped singing.
The other workers noticed immediately. The fields went quiet in a way they had never been quiet before. Oral tradition preserved at Mloud Plantation includes testimony from a woman named Hagar Brown, a name that appears in the South Carolina WPA Slave Narrative Archive, who described the silence that followed as something she knew from the first morning would never be undone. Annie had sung every day since anyone could remember. The day the child was taken, the sun came up and there was nothing. Brown said she knew that day something was gone that was not coming back. 3 weeks later, Annie died. The plantation ledger records her death as fever. Fever was the word used for many things: malaria, typhoid, infection, grief so profound the body gives up. Medical literature confirms that extreme emotional trauma can physically weaken the heart muscle, causing severe cardiac failure. The condition is known as Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, broken heart syndrome. The body can die from loss. She was buried in the enslaved cemetery on the property's grounds. Her grave is unmarked. Mloud Plantation is now a historic site. The main house remains, along with 8 original slave cabins along the street. One of them is cabin number 4. And cabin number 4 sings. Staff and visitors report hearing it in the late afternoon when the light slants low through the live oaks and the temperature begins to drop. A woman's voice singing spirituals in Gullah Creole. Multiple staff members and independent visitors have reported the sound over decades. When anyone enters the cabin, the singing stops. Linguists who study Gullah note that the language's tonal frequencies are distinct. They occupy a specific acoustic range designed to carry over distance and remain unintelligible to untrained ears. The singing reported in cabin number 4 occupies that same frequency. It is not just a melody, it is a specific frequency of communication, a sonic fingerprint left on the structure itself. Multiple visitors have reported seeing a woman standing in the doorway of the cabin at dusk. She wears a plain dress and head wrap. She faces outward, toward the road that once led to Charleston's slave markets. She does not move, she does not turn. When witnesses look away and back, she is gone. The most persistent report is this: people standing near the cabin describe an overwhelming sensation of grief so intense they begin crying without understanding why. Not their own sadness, someone else's, a feeling that passes through them and then vanishes. Visitors have written in the guest book
that they arrived at the cabin composed and left weeping, unable to explain it as anything other than a sorrow that did not belong to them. Annie is not remembered by descendants. She is not honored in family oral traditions that survived. She is a fragment, a first name, a silence that lasted 160 years, until the cabin started singing again. The Plantation enterprise was, at its core, a masterclass in ruthless accounting designed to write off human loss silently on paper. But 100 miles south, along the Georgia coast, the system didn't just abandon names in a ledger, it abandoned bodies in the dark.
The Hermitage Plantation, situated along the Savannah River outside Savannah, Georgia, was established in the 1820s by Scottish immigrant Henry McAlpin. While neighboring properties grew cotton, the waterlogged earth of the Hermitage Plantation was engineered for a much deadlier yield: rice. Rice was one of the most profitable crops in the South, but it was also one of the deadliest to produce. The fields had to be flooded and drained in carefully timed cycles. Workers stood in water for hours at a time, exposed to malaria, typhoid, dysentery, and water moccasins. The mortality rate for enslaved people working rice estates was significantly higher than those working cotton or tobacco. Rice planters operating the Hermitage expected to lose workers. They budgeted for it. The main house at the Hermitage Plantation had a cistern, an underground water storage tank, 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, that collected rainwater for the family's use. Cisterns on estates like this were not simply functional, they were status markers. Clean water was reserved for the planter's family. Enslaved workers drank from nearby creeks and rivers that were contaminated by upstream outhouses and animal waste. The same plantation system that generated the McAlpins' wealth also ensured that the people generating it would drink poison. In the summer of 1832, a cholera epidemic swept through coastal Georgia. It thrived in the stagnant, contaminated conditions enslaved workers were forced to endure, attacking the body so violently that fatal dehydration could occur within 12 to 18 hours of the first symptoms. Between June and September 1832, 14 enslaved people died at the Hermitage Plantation. 11 of them were children under the age of 10. McAlpin's 1832 ledger, preserved in institutional archives, records those 11 names exactly as they were written: Cato, Bella, Dinah, Peter, Flora, Rachel, Samson, Phoebe, July, Venus, Ned. Cholera deaths required immediate burial. The bodies could not be kept, they could not be washed or prepared according to the traditions enslaved communities tried to maintain. They had to go into the ground. But the ground would not hold them. The Savannah riverfront sits on a high water table. In the summer of 1832, after months of heavy rain, the soil likely underwent liquefaction, where the ground becomes saturated to the point that it behaves like a liquid rather than a solid. Graves could not be dug because the holes filled with water as quickly as they were opened. The earth literally refused to hold a grave. According to testimony collected during WPA oral history interviews in the 1930s, several of the children's bodies were placed temporarily in the cistern. They were wrapped in cloth and lowered into the dry storage tank. The plan was to remove them once the ground dried and give them proper burial. The ground dried in late September. According to the testimony, the bodies were not removed. Either McAlpin forgot, or he decided it was easier to seal the cistern and dig a new one than to retrieve decomposing remains from 12 feet below ground. The cistern was capped with a heavy stone lid in the fall of 1832. McAlpin's records note the construction of a second cistern in early 1833. The original cistern remained sealed.
In 1964, contractors preparing the Hermitage Plantation site for a residential subdivision opened the old cistern. They found skeletal remains at the bottom, at least 4 individuals, including 3 children and 1 adult female. The remains were removed and buried in an unmarked location. No public record was made of the discovery at the time. The account has been preserved through oral testimony from people connected to the work. The cistern was filled with concrete. The subdivision was marketed as new homes on historic ground. The phrase was used to sell houses. It did not mention the unmarked graves of enslaved children. Since the 1980s, multiple families living in the house built directly over the cistern have reported the same phenomena. Laughter, late at night, coming from the backyard near where the cistern was sealed. Multiple children playing, high-pitched, delighted, the kind of noise children make when they are running around outside in summer. When parents investigate, no one is there. Neighbors confirm their own children were indoors and asleep. The sound of splashing water. Despite the cistern being filled with concrete, residents report hearing movement through water underground. Not a pipe, not a drain. The sound of a person or people moving through standing water. Playful, deliberate, localized to the exact spot above the cistern. This detail is more significant than it first appears. The high water table that prevented the children's burial in 1832 still exists beneath that suburban lawn. Water still moves beneath the ground, through the same soil that refused to hold graves 190 years ago. The splashing sounds reported by modern residents may not be ghosts in the traditional sense. They may be the sound of water moving through the same space where the children's bodies were kept. The earth still refusing to let what was placed in it go unremembered. In 2009, according to the family's account, a 4-year-old girl living in the house talked frequently to the kids in the ground. Her parents assumed it was an imaginary friend until she named them Bella, Peter, Rachel. The parents said they had no prior knowledge of the estate's history. A local historian, contacted by the family, confirmed that the names matched 3 of the 11 children recorded in McAlpin's 1832 ledger. The family moved 6 months later. Investigators who worked the site in 2011 reported capturing children's voices in the yard, asking to be let out, saying it was dark. The current residents have lived there since 2017. They report nothing unusual. Previous families, at least 4 between 1982 and 2017, moved within 2 to 3 years. One family said simply that they could not stay. The kids would not stop crying. The physical structures of the Hermitage Plantation are gone. The main house is gone. The fields are gone. The cistern is sealed under a suburban lawn. But the children are still there. 11 children died in summer 1832. Their bodies were placed in a cistern until the ground dried. The ground dried. Nobody came back for them. The cistern was sealed for 132 years. The laughter never stopped. The children at the Hermitage were abandoned because the system made abandonment legal. It had statutes for that. It had statutes for everything. 500 miles west in Louisiana, and legal code older than America itself had already decided exactly what could be done to a person's body and had written the punishments in numbered articles, like livestock regulations. The mutilation was not a crime. It was Article 38.
The Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, was founded in 1796 by General David Bradford on high ground above the Mississippi River floodplains. If the Hermitage was defined by what the system discarded and forgot, the Myrtles Plantation was defined by the cold, calculated violence the law made official. Known today as America's most haunted house, the machinery of tourism has processed the Myrtles Plantation so many times that its authentic historical foundation is often buried under its own reputation. At the center of that reputation is a cheval mirror, an antique, approximately 6 feet tall with an ornate gilded frame, original to the property. It has been professionally cleaned and re-silvered multiple times. Despite this, the mirror retains what appeared to be handprints and facial impressions
that sit within the backing of the glass rather than on its surface. Investigators who have examined the mirror describe the marks as consistent with the hands of children. The cleaning has never removed them. Southern custom of the era required mirrors in a house of mourning to be covered immediately to prevent the souls of the newly dead from becoming trapped inside. The family, the oral tradition holds, did not cover the mirror. To understand what may be in that mirror, you have to understand a woman who wore a green turban. The legend says her name was Chloe, no last name, no age, no origin, no record of her existence in any Myrtles Plantation ledger, bill of sale, or legal document survives. The historical record does not confirm her. But what the historical record does confirm is what the story describes happening to her. According to the legend, Chloe was an enslaved household servant caught eavesdropping on the plantation owner, Judge Clark Woodruff. As punishment, one of her ears was cut off. After that, she always wore a green turban to cover what had been done to her. Article 38 of the Louisiana Code Nor, the legal code governing slavery in French and Spanish Louisiana, stated explicitly that an enslaved person caught eavesdropping could be punished by the cutting of ears. This was not a rumor or folk tradition. It was written into law. The mutilation described in the Chloe legend was not invented by storytellers. It was codified by lawmakers. The legend continues. Chloe baked a cake laced with oleander and served it to Woodruff's family. Oleander is one of the most toxic plants in North America. All parts of the plant contain cardiac glycosides that disrupt the electrical signals of the heart. For a child, as few as 2 leaves can be fatal. Death occurs within hours from cardiac arrest, violent, fast, and unmistakable. There's no dosage that produces a mild illness and then stops. The margin between sick and dead is essentially zero. Woodruff's wife and 2 young daughters died. Anyone who grew up near oleander, as enslaved people in Louisiana did, would have known exactly what the plant was capable of. The story, told for tourism, frames it as a desperate miscalculation. What the plant's toxicology makes clear is that there was no miscalculation, only a choice made by a woman the historical record refuses to name under a system the Code Nor had already decided she could not survive intact. And yet, people report seeing her, a woman in a green turban. Sightings described since at least the mid-20th century, predating the commercial haunted tourism the property now runs on. Visitors describe a figure in period clothing moving through the grounds, near the old quarters, near the gardens, on the front porch. Every account across decades gives the same detail: the green turban. The punishment described in her story was not invented. The turban she wears is not costume, it is evidence. The apparition walking the grounds of the Myrtles Plantation is not just a woman, it is Article 38 of the Code Nor made visible on the property that benefited from the law that mutilated her. The Myrtles fills the silence of its unrecorded history with a visual apparition trapped behind glass. But there is a plantation further north along the Caron River where the haunting requires no mirrors, no folklore, and no fragile outlines to make its presence known. It relies on the terrifying, inescapable acoustics of a weapon made of sound.
Magnolia Plantation, located along the Caron River in Derry, Louisiana, was established in the 1830s by Ambrose Lecomte. Operating at a scale that dwarfed its neighbors, Magnolia Plantation held the largest enslaved population in Natchitoches Parish. At its height, the estate enslaved 275 people who worked the vast cotton fields and maintained the property under a brutal overseer system. 8 of their original brick cabins still stand at Magnolia Plantation, preserved today by the National Park Service as a permanent physical record of that labor. The overseer was a hired position, usually a white man from a lower economic class, who was paid to extract maximum labor through violence and intimidation.
The overseer lived on the property, reported to the owner, Ambrose Lecomte II, and had near total authority over the day-to-day lives of the enslaved population. At Magnolia, the overseer used a large brass bell mounted on a post near the enslaved workers' quarters to control every aspect of the daily schedule. The bell rang at 4:30 a.m. to wake the workers. It rang at sunset to signal the end of the day. If the bell rang between those hours, it meant someone was about to be punished. Bells like this were used throughout the plantation South. They were not decorative or ceremonial. They were instruments of control, designed to regulate the movements of hundreds of people without requiring a single word to be spoken. A bell of that size, an estimated 40 pounds of brass, could carry for half a mile across open fields. This was intentional. Every person on the property needed to hear it, whether they were in the quarters, at the far end of the cotton rows, or working near the river. The bell was the voice of the overseer, amplified to reach everyone within the plantation's boundaries. A bell of that size creates a specific sound pressure level. At close range, a 40-pound brass bell produces vibrations that resonate in the human chest cavity. The sound is not only heard, it is felt. Overseers at Magnolia were known to ring the bell at midday and select a person at random to punish, regardless of whether they had committed any infraction. The purpose was not punishment for a specific act. The purpose was terror, to remind every person working those fields that violence could come at any moment, without reason, without warning. A formerly enslaved man from the Cane River region, whose testimony survives in the 1936 WPA archive, described what that midday ringing meant to everyone who heard it. Every person in the fields stopped moving, held their breath, and waited, because somebody was about to bleed, and nobody knew if it would be them. 39 lashes was the standard number. Louisiana law technically prohibited cruel and unusual punishment of enslaved people, a statute that existed on paper but was almost never enforced. The legal limit was 40 lashes. Overseers stayed at 39 to avoid even the appearance of breaking the law. The system was designed not to protect enslaved people, but to protect the owner's property value. The word reasonable, when applied to punishment, referred to the market value of the person being punished, not their capacity to suffer. People were whipped at Magnolia's post and sent back to the fields. Some survived, some did not. The plantation's enslaved cemetery holds at least 32 unmarked graves identified by ground-penetrating radar in 2010. The names of most of those buried there are lost. That is not an accident. It is what the system intended.
When Union forces occupied the Cane River area in 1863, the main house was burned. The overseer was reportedly shot and killed on the front porch steps. The formerly enslaved people who remained on the property tore down the bell and threw it into the Cane River. It was never recovered. Magnolia Plantation still operates as a historic site. The overseer's bell is not present on the property, but visitors and staff report hearing it anyway. A brass bell, 3 rings, always 3. The sound is heard most frequently around 4:30 a.m. and near sunset, the hours the bell marked the beginning and end of the workday. The sound has been reported by independent visitors and long-term staff over many years. When it is heard, no source has ever been found. When the bell rings, visitors near the site of the old whipping post describe a physical response. Their backs tighten, their shoulders pull, their breathing becomes shallow. One visitor described it as not their own fear, but someone else's pressing through them. This reaction is not purely psychological. The body remembers the frequency of that bell. The sound pressure level of a 40-pound brass bell creates a sympathetic resonance in the human chest cavity. The location itself may carry the memory of that vibration, the trauma associated with that specific frequency imprinted on the place where it was experienced most intensely.
The haunting is a matter of physics. Most chilling is what can be heard after the bell. Footsteps, many of them, running. The sound of bare feet on dirt and wooden porch planks, the creak of cabin doors, the sound of people scrambling to line up, to be seen, to prove they were not the one who would be chosen. No one is ever visible. Staff who have worked at Magnolia for years describe the same thing. The bell rings, and then they run. And the realization that follows is worse than the sound itself. That they are still running, that they have been running for 160 years, because the bell will not stop. The bell was thrown into the Caron River in 1863. It still rings, and when it rings, the people who spent their lives listening for it are still responding, still afraid. At Magnolia, the bell controlled 275 people through the threat of what would follow if they stopped moving. 50 miles south along the Mississippi River, the system had found something more efficient than a bell. It did not need to threaten the people working its fields. It simply consumed them. And when they were gone, it consumed their children.
Habitation Heidel, known today as the Whitney Plantation, sits on the west bank of the Mississippi River in Wallace, Louisiana. Founded in 1752 by a German immigrant family, the estate grew indigo before converting entirely to sugarcane in the early 19th century. Sugar transformed the lower Mississippi Valley into one of the wealthiest agricultural regions in the world. It also produced one of the highest mortality rates of any industry in the antebellum South, higher than cotton, higher than rice, higher than tobacco. The reason was physics. Sugarcane processing required open iron kettles, massive cauldrons holding hundreds of gallons of cane juice, heated to temperatures between 200 and 220 degrees Fahrenheit. Enslaved workers stood over these kettles for hours, stirring the boiling liquid with long wooden paddles to prevent crystallization. The steam alone caused third-degree burns to exposed skin. A fall into a kettle did not produce a survivable injury, it produced a death record. The harvest season ran from October through January, 4 months of 18 to 20-hour days, 7 days a week, with no rest for illness and no pause for weather. Planters called this the grinding. The word was accurate. Louisiana's sugar estates did not work people, they consumed them. Planters operating properties along the Mississippi River corridor calculated human mortality into their annual operating budgets, the way a manufacturer calculates equipment depreciation. They imported enslaved people from the Upper South in bulk, specifically because they expected to use them up. Records from St. John the Baptist Parish show that the average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a sugar estate after arrival was 7 years. 7 years. That number sits differently when you understand what those 7 years contained. Burns from the kettles, lacerations from the machetes used to harvest cane stalks, exhaustion so profound that workers fell asleep standing in the fields, hernias from lifting cane loads that weighed over 100 pounds, eyes permanently damaged by steam and smoke, bodies that were 30 years old and functioned like they were 60. The infant mortality rate at Whitney Plantation in the surrounding estates was not a natural phenomenon. It was engineered by the system. Enslaved women working sugar estates were forced back into the fields within 2 to 3 weeks of giving birth. The infants were left at the edge of the field or in the care of elderly enslaved people too old to work, women in their 60s and 70s managing 6, 8, 10 infants at once, with no medical supplies, no clean water, and inadequate food. Breast milk production requires caloric intake. The rations issued to enslaved people on sugar estates, typically a pound of salt pork and a quart of corn per day,
were insufficient to sustain the caloric demands of both field labor and nursing. Mothers returned to their children at the end of 18-hour shifts, unable to feed them adequately. The infants starved slowly while their mothers worked. Those who survived infancy faced the flooded cane fields. Sugar cultivation required standing water. The fields were perpetually damp, mosquito-saturated environments that produced malaria at rates a modern epidemiologist would classify as epidemic. Children under 5 have no immunity to malaria. Their small bodies cannot survive the dehydration caused by repeated malarial fevers. They died in weeks.
The Field of Angels does not memorialize tragic accidents. It memorializes the predictable, calculated outcomes of a system that knew exactly what it was doing to children and continued doing it because the sugar still needed processing. Etched into the monument are the names of 2,200 enslaved infants and children who died in St. John the Baptist Parish between 1823 and 1863, not from one property, from one parish, in 40 years. Some entries list only infant, unnamed. Some list an age in weeks: Cato, Victoire, Modeste, Basile, Fëanor. Names pulled one by one from Plantation birth and death registers by Whitney's researchers decades after the system that created those registers had been dismantled and forgotten. The physical phenomena reported at Whitney Plantation are not centered on the main house. They are centered on the Field of Angels and the restored cabin rows. The tugging is the most reported and the most consistent. Visitors walking the memorial path describe a sudden, gentle pull at the hem of a shirt or coat, at the height of a small child's reach. Not a brush, not wind, a deliberate, directional tug. When they turn, the path is empty. It has been reported by enough independent visitors over enough years that the staff no longer express surprise when someone mentions it. Near the Antioch Baptist Church and the cabin rows, visitors report hearing weeping. Not ambient sound, not echo. Low, exhausted, immediate. The kind of crying that comes from someone who has been crying for a long time and has almost nothing left. It appears in empty corners of the structures and stops when people enter. Staff members who work the property regularly describe a localized cold spot near the names of the youngest children, the names with ages listed in weeks, not years. Not the generalized cool of a shaded area, several degrees appearing and disappearing in the same location. The original iron sugar kettles still sit on the grass. The cypress wood of the cabins still holds the tool marks of the people who built them. The names carved into the granite do not allow the history to recede into comfortable myth. 2,200 children, one parish, 40 years. The tugging at the hem is not a mystery. It is a child who was placed in a register and then forgotten, reaching for the first person who came close enough. Whitney carved the memory of its dead into cold, unyielding granite to ensure they would never be erased. 500 miles north, another plantation preserved the trauma of its past, not in stone, but by drawing it directly into the biological grain of the building itself.
Caron Plantation in Franklin, Tennessee, was constructed in 1826 by Nashville Mayor Randall McGavick as a sweeping federal-style brick mansion surrounded by vast acreage. The machine of slavery did not only extract labor from these fields, it uprooted lives at will. By 1860, Caron Plantation enslaved 39 people who worked the land and maintained the household, functioning as the terminal point for one highly documented uprooted life. Among them was a woman named Maria Reddick. Maria had not been born at Caron Plantation. She came from Ducroix Plantation in Louisiana, brought to Franklin by Carrie McGavick when she married John McGavick in 1848. She had been uprooted once already, taken from one state to another, from one household to another, with no say in any of it. At Carnton, she worked as a house servant, managing the interior of the plantation home. By the standards of the time, she was considered trusted, which meant she was allowed inside the main house unsupervised and had access to spaces other enslaved people did not. Trust, in the language of slavery, was a word that described usefulness, not affection. As the war moved closer, John McGavock sent most of Carnton's enslaved people south to Louisiana to prevent them reaching federal lines. Mariah was among those sent. She was displaced again, this time to Alabama, where she worked in another household. She returned to Franklin after the war, having survived 2 forced relocations before freedom arrived. On November 30, 1664, the Battle of Franklin was fought on the land surrounding Carnton Plantation. It was one of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War. In 5 hours, over 9,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured, more casualties than American forces suffered on Omaha Beach during D-Day. Confederate forces under General John Bell Hood launched a frontal assault against entrenched Union positions. The attack failed catastrophically. Bodies piled in front of the Union breastworks. The fighting continued after dark. When it ended, Carnton Plantation was directly behind the Confederate lines. The house became a field hospital. Wounded soldiers were carried into every available space: the dining room, the bedrooms, the hallways, the porches, the yard. The dining room table, a heavy wooden piece built to seat the McGavock family and their guests, became an amputation table. Surgeons worked by candlelight for 36 hours without stopping. They sawed through shattered bone, dropped severed limbs into barrels, and moved immediately to the next man. There was no anesthesia for most, whiskey if they were lucky, leather straps to bite down on, hands to hold them still. The table was so saturated with blood that it could not be cleaned. It was burned 2 weeks later. The enslaved people at Carnton Plantation were forced to assist. They carried bodies, held basins, cleaned wounds, held men down during amputations. Mariah Reddick held the lantern so surgeons could see what they were doing. She handed them instruments. She stayed in the room when men screamed. She had no choice. The war did not free her. Tennessee did not abolish slavery until February 1865, 3 months after the battle. Her legal status was unchanged. Mariah was freed in 1865. She did not leave Franklin. She built a life there, working as a midwife to the women of the town, both black and white, for decades after the war. She married, she had children, she remained close to the McGavock family. She lived downtown, near the railroad depot. Mariah Reddick died in 1922. She is buried with her husband at Toussaint Louverture Cemetery in Franklin, Tennessee. Her name is marked, her grave is on the stone. The Battle of Franklin Trust has commissioned a bronze bust in her honor. She is documented, remembered, and known. What was done to her, the displacement, the forced labor during a battle that was not hers, the decades of service inside a house where men had screamed and bled, that is documented too.
Carnton Plantation is now a museum. The dining room is preserved as it appeared in 1864. In archival photographs of the room, the dark staining along the baseboards and across the floor is still clearly visible, the residue of 36 hours of surgical work despite more than 150 years of cleaning. The dining room floor is made of heart pine, a wood known for its extreme porosity and high resin content. Heart pine does not simply absorb liquid. Its dense, resinous cell structure traps organic matter deep within the wood grain. The blood from the amputations did not pool on the surface. It was drawn into the material of the house itself, where ordinary cleaning cannot reach. This is what makes the phenomena reported in that room worth considering. The smell of blood, metallic, sharp, overwhelming, appears suddenly and disappears just as fast. Visitors who have no knowledge of the room's history report it before guides can explain. What they may be detecting is not a supernatural event, it is a chemical release. The house, responding to shifts in humidity and temperature, exhaling what it absorbed 160 years ago.
The haunting is not separate from the building, it is part of its physical structure. The sound of sawing, rhythmic, metal on bone, reported most frequently in the late afternoon and early evening, the hours the surgeons worked after the battle. Staff have investigated multiple times. No construction, no maintenance, no source. A woman standing in the corner of the dining room. She wears a plain dark dress and a head wrap. She holds something witnesses describe as a light, a lantern, a candle, something glowing. She does not move. She does not speak. She watches the table. When approached, she is no longer there. The figure has been reported by staff, visitors, and investigators independently over decades. The descriptions are consistent. A black woman, middle-aged, plain clothing, holding a light, standing in the southeast corner of the room. Investigators have reported capturing a woman's voice in the dining room. Short, calm commands, consistent with what was said during amputations without anesthesia. The voice of someone who had done this many times and knew there was no point in anything other than steadiness. Staff members who have worked at Caron Plantation for years describe her the same way. Not haunting, not angry, not restless. Working. Mariah Reddick held the lantern while surgeons sawed through bone in a war she had no stake in, on land she never owned. She held the light. She handed the instruments. She stayed in the room because she had no choice. She is still there.
Praise Annie at McLeod Plantation. The cabin still sings. 11 children at the Hermitage, left in a cistern, never retrieved. The laughter never stopped. A woman in a green turban at the Myrtles. The records do not confirm her. The marks on the mirror remain. 275 people enslaved at Magnolia. 32 unmarked graves still unclaimed. The bell in the Cane River still rings, and the running follows. 2,200 children etched into granite at Whitney. Something is still tugging at the hem. Mariah Reddick at Caron. She stayed because she had no choice. She is still holding the light. There are 45,000 documented plantation sites in the American South. Most are now woods, suburbs, or shopping malls. The history was not erased, it was built over. The dead never needed us to remember them. They never stopped being there.